From a twisted mass of rotted and broken timbers to a living, functioning and impressive example of a medieval whole house. This is a story of reconstruction and restoration that saved one of the earliest examples of timber-framed buildings in Essex from the demolition hammer, providing a glimpse into the past for generations of the future. It is also a detective story, but one without a crime, unless the passage of time and the ravages of insects and weather can be so called. Number 17 South Street, Rochford, is the prosaic modern address of this charming building now in use as Rochford Council offices. But it was not always so. In years past, it was known to some as the Moot House, because people believed it had been used for public meetings. It was also called the Pink House, because of the colour of its walls that distinguished it from other houses in South Street. These days, however, it is referred to quite simply as the Old House, a name which accurately reflects both its early origins and the friendly familiarity in which it has come to be held. For years, the Old House had been sinking into neglect, not by any willful act, but rather through the inability of its owners to cope with the strain of maintaining a 10-roomed building that had long ago seen its best days. Then, in June 1982, Rochford Council bought it with the intention of preserving what was then officially recognised as a 15th century building, a house dating from the time of the Plantagenet kings. Clearly, a great deal of work needed to be done, and the old house was soon enveloped in plastic sheeting to protect it from the elements while work proceeded. And it was beneath that plastic shroud that skilled detective work would prise open and reveal the old house's amazing secrets. Outwardly, the old house is typical of many in East Anglia, with its central main hall joined by two crosswings in a U-shape. But as layer after layer was peeled away, suspicions grew that the origins of the building were much earlier than had been supposed. Cecil Hewitt, consultant to Essex County Council and a national authority on medieval timber-framed buildings, saw from the newly exposed joints that the main hall had been built in the late 13th century. Carpenter's marks in Roman numerals attested to the extensive additions that came later, and reinforced Mr. Hewitt in his belief that here was a remarkably early building, much earlier than the 15th century dating by which it was officially listed. His view was to be confirmed later by radiocarbon tests on small samples of oak joists from the main hall, dating the building at about 1270. But further evidence was to be found. Essex County archaeologists conducted extensive digs, concentrating largely on suspected drainage systems. Among many unexpected finds, they came up with a silver penny from the reign of Henry III, whose writ ran in the land from 1216 to 1272. With the workmen busy around them, the archaeologists continued their investigations and unearthed pieces of cutlery and pottery, a medieval ring, and some shells and bones, as well as a lady's shoe. This latter was probably placed with the silver penny as a good luck talisman during the original building work. But conclusive proof of the old house's ancient origins was the discovery of an open hearth, lined with tiles and surrounded by an oaken curb in the middle of the main hall. This was later to be restored to its original state and preserved for display.
The interest of Essex County Council Archaeology Section in this project is to try to elucidate the building sequence here and also to see if there are any previous buildings underneath it. We've done other work in Rochford itself, and this will all go to help us build up a pattern of medieval life in the town.
From such evidence, historians were indeed able to reconstruct a picture of life in the hall, with the entire family living, cooking, eating and sleeping, as well as often keeping their cattle for mutual warmth, in the same square chamber open to the roof. The hearth, heaped with logs, provided the main source of warmth, light and cooking facilities, with the smoke drifting upwards to escape through open louvers in the thatched rooftop. The master, a man of considerable substance, and his family would probably have taken their meals at a table on a raised platform across the north wall. The servants would have eaten at tables running down the length of the straw-carpeted hall and slept on them at night. More radiocarbon tests showed that it was some 20 or 30 years before the family could enjoy a little more privacy in the newly constructed north wing. It was another 100 years before the servants were provided with a proper workplace and quarters, with the addition of the south wing. In the case of each wing, the only means of access to the upper floor was by ladder. For the mysterious and still unknown inhabitants of the old house, little seemed to have changed for the next 400 years. In the tiny market village at the lowest ford over the River Roch, life followed the slow patterns of nature. While Henry IV fought at Agincourt, the War of the Roses swept the land, Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, including the nearby Prittlewell Priory, and Shakespeare established himself as England's greatest playwright.
The quality of mercy is not strange.
But suddenly, in the 17th century, there was a great change in building styles. The old house was caught up in the great race to modernize. Among many other changes, an upper floor was constructed in the main hall with a dormer window to light it. And it was the addition of this upper floor which concealed for centuries the fact that there had indeed been architectural stirrings at the old house during the 400-year sleep. As workmen in the 1980s stripped away the renovations from down the ages, they revealed perhaps the old house's greatest secret, the magnificent 16th century chimney in the main hall that is one of the building's greatest attractions today. Its size and the delicate brickwork, typical of the early 15th century, are testimony to the prestige and wealth of the owner of the old house at that time. Only a few chimneys of such elegant design have been discovered in Essex, and this, with its trefoiled arches and diapered patterns, is widely regarded as among the best of them. Another remarkable discovery during the 20th century restoration was the smoke-blackened timbers in the roof above the original hearth, evidence of the original smoke-venting system. These have been left untreated but protected from decay or insect attack by the heavy soot incrustation. The 17th century burst of building added a chimney stack of less impressive but still cherishable design in the north wing, as well as staircases to the upper floors and an extension behind the main hall. This work, extending into the 18th century, marks the heyday of the old house as a home for a family of some prestige. From then on, the building slipped gradually into a long, slow decline, which continued until Rochford Council decided to restore it. The old house was being used as a chandler's shop by George Garrett in the 18th century when a square Georgian bay was added to the front of the north wing. In the early 19th century, George Turner, a cobbler, rented the old house as premises from Thomas Hurst Marsh, who also owned the neighbouring Red House. During the last half of that century, John Hedgecock, another cobbler, could be seen making boots and shoes in one window, while his wife, Emma, an accomplished needlewoman, sat in the other, running their fancy goods business. The old house passed through several hands subsequently, being used as a family home by, among others, a solicitor and a retired minister. When Rochford Council acquired it for £45,000 in January 1982, many believed the old house had long passed any kind of useful life. Certainly, it had proved too much of a burden for successive owners. From the very beginning, it was clear that such a priceless example of early medieval craftsmanship should not be brought back from the grave only to serve as a museum piece. It was built for a useful life, and, having survived 700 years, it needed the continuing sustenance of life and action. The decision was made even before Rochford Council completed its purchase of the old house. It would house the chief executive suite, providing office accommodation for him and 12 members of his staff. For the council's team of architects, it was a daunting task. From the roof to the floors, this building, which would have to meet exacting modern specifications for office use, was on the verge of collapse. The north wing fell in during early investigations. The most urgent job, therefore, was to install internal scaffolding to prop it up. Work on the site began in earnest 6 months after the purchase, with teams of men hired to help clear out 20 skiploads of modern building materials used by the previous owner, as well as various items of furniture. At the same time, the project architect was busy drawing up endless sections, elevations, and floor plans to locate every structural detail. The preparatory work continued until the end of December, to be followed immediately by erection of the outer cocoon of steel and plastic to prevent any further deterioration as work progressed. This was a wise decision, for despite the fact that the old house was ahead of its time in being built on stone foundations, it was leaning to the rear and had to be jacked up by as much as 18 inches, room by room. It meant stripping the frame of all its cladding. In the process, some fine examples of wattle and daub panels were uncovered. These were carefully protected, and 2, showing the mud, dung, and reeds and rushes gathered from the nearby River Roach, have been preserved for display under glass panels in the main hall, where they were found. The stripping of the walls also uncovered the remnants of rare and imposing triple bracing in the front wall on either side of the main support post to the hall. Such multiple bracing is typical of the short decorated period of Gothic architecture and must have looked very imposing. Unfortunately, they were too badly decayed to be left exposed to view. In tackling this huge project, both the council architects and the main contractors, Haynes and Smith of Southend, were united in one thought. As much as possible of the original structure should be retained and any replacement timbers crafted in the traditional manner. But this presented a huge problem. Deathwatch beetle, furniture beetle, and dry and damp rot had caused extensive damage over the centuries. Some beams and joists had been eaten away from their original square cross-section into log shapes by the beetle. In some cases, to remove timbers crumbled beyond repair would have meant to weaken linked structures and perhaps ruin them. Fortunately, modern techniques could be brought to the rescue of the ancient. Rickard's Timber Treatment Limited, specialists in renovation of damaged wood, were brought in at a cost of £50,000 to mastermind this aspect of the restoration. One of the most dramatic and effective techniques employed was the use of epoxy resin, which can be used to strengthen, replace, and even imitate wood. This massive tie beam in the front room of the north wing had been seriously weakened and then broken by the removal of supporting timbers for some unknown reason more than 100 years ago. It balanced precariously on a small brace and was crudely lashed along its length to a piece of old railway line. It was first temporarily repaired, and then, using a technique similar to this, carpenters carefully removed a section along its top edge and inserted a carbon fibre rod. Then epoxy resin was poured in around it, filling the void and giving the new man-made beam even more strength and resilience than the original oak, while at the same time leaving its outward appearance unchanged. Similar techniques were used all over the old house. Weakened beams were boxed in with plywood and epoxy resin poured in to give renewed strength. After sanding and staining, they were indistinguishable from the original. Replacement of minor members, such as these stud fixings, brought into play epoxy-bonded dowel joints to replace the traditional mortise and tenons. New sections of posts and beams were spliced in with seat-cut splice joints or traditional scarf joints. Gentle sandblasting cleaned and brightened all the framework without damaging the original tool markings. And timber preservative was applied to guard against further infestation and rot. An exciting discovery during the work was the location of diamond-shaped window mullions, destroyed long ago, and new timbers were inserted to recall the original effect. These windows would have been unglazed and covered by wooden shutters at night. Rotted, insect-eaten and broken rafters were built up with the aid of softwood top plates, giving renewed strength and straightening the new roof line. Thin, flat steel bracing gave the roof a lateral stability that was lacking in the original construction. The old joints of repaired rafters came back together neatly, allowing the new oak pegs to slide sweetly into the original dowel holes. Wherever possible in the restoration, spare wood from reconstruction was cleaned up and used in other parts of the house. But much of the timber brought in was in fact far from new. A source of well-seasoned oak was found in the demolition of an overhead gantry at John Sadd's old timber wharf at Maldon, just a few miles up the Essex coast. This was fashioned and cut to size by Barhams of Westcliff, who wore out many a saw blade on the iron like timber. Despite the necessary introduction of modern methods, the decision to use traditional materials and techniques as far as possible was rigorously applied, even to the recladding of the walls. Modern fiberglass quilt insulation, vapor barriers and breather papers were allied to old methods, with lath and plaster to create an effective but traditionally based skin for the old house. 1-inch by 1/2-inch laths, secured at 1/2-inch intervals to the studs, were coated in traditional lime hair plaster. And, instead of using a modern external emulsion, the old values of lime wash were revived. It was made on site to the age-old formula with lime putty and tallow, heated and blended in a large tank. The distemper for the inside walls set off a nationwide search for a manufacturer of this long-ignored coating. The last remaining maker was tracked down in the Irish Republic. When the old house was first built, it had a thatched roof. This was later replaced by burnt clay tiles. Many had survived the stripping down and were reused as the roof was made weathertight above its modern insulation. One of the last stages in the long process of restoration was the replacement of the floors. One room alone needed little extra work. The upstairs back room of the north wing had its original oak floorboards still in good condition and secured with wide blacksmith's nails. Apart from cleaning, it needed little restoration. Testimony to the quality of work put into the master's bedroom. Elsewhere, wooden floors were covered with plywood and strengthened to conform with modern office use specifications. Ground floors were concreted over damp-proof membranes and paved with brick. The biggest headache of all was the provision of all the services needed to run a modern office. Heating, water, power, computer cables, telephone links, and security systems all had to be concealed, or at least disguised, to maintain the atmosphere of antiquity, inside and out. This was achieved to a remarkable degree, aided by careful and discreet choices of furniture, carpets, and curtains, which balanced modern efficiency with a lasting impression of age. In keeping with the spirit of the whole project, even the fine oak refectory table and matching chairs in the main hall were made from wood left over from repairs to the timber frame. In all, the restoration of the old house to its early splendour took 10 months and cost £235,000. Was it all worth it? Certainly it was, if only as an example of how a town's early history can be thrown into sharp relief for future generations by dedicated and conscientious attention to minute detail. The old house has now been designated a Grade II starred listed building, an award previously withheld because the house was in such a poor state of repair. There was no doubt either in the minds of the townsfolk who crowded into the old house at its official opening by Councillor Miss Beryl Lovett, Chairman of the Council, on the 8th of December 1983.
And a lot of you here have children, and their children and their children's children will be able to come and look at this house, and they'll learn from the house itself the history of the place in which they live. And I think that's really very splendid. I think we are very fortunate to have such a place in our area, and I must say it looks beautiful beyond all my wildest dreams. And I want to say how very proud I am to be part of a council that got on with it and made sure that it stayed here rather than let it just fall to the ground, because that's what would have happened. I'm finding it a little strange that I'm supposed to open 17 South Street. I think that she never closed, and she just had a little rest. With pleasure, I pull this cord, and I reopen 17 South Street, and God bless all who work in her.
In the run-up to Christmas, more than 3,000 people came to admire the amazing transformation from ruin to pride. And still they come, the young and the not-so-young, on frequent guided tours, while the essential work of the council goes on around them. Against all the odds, the 700-year-old house is alive again and ready for another 700 years. But let the last words be with Councillor Miss Lovett and the Chief Executive, Arthur Cook, at that memorable opening ceremony.
The house, ladies and gentlemen, is yours for...
Only don't take it away.
And I'm sure they never will.